May version of Ohio Workforce Coalition's monthly webinar series. And today we are talking budget and budgeting. So it will be lots of great fun, lots of information. Before we get started, I do want to kick us off with, again, just a welcome. And I am always excited on these calls to see new faces as well as faces that have been with us for a minute and continue to come back. So thank you for being here. Each month, we do work hard to try and bring timely and relevant content to you all as members of the coalition. And last month, actually April, we welcomed members officially. And so the coalition does have a new membership structure with a range of benefits and I think options for organizations and individuals at every level. So we would love to have you check that out. It is membership dues that will support our ability to continue to bring these sorts of webinars to Ohioans across the state, as well as to add in some extra capacity building, research, and so on. So please consider joining. Also, last month, we launched our first Workforce Leadership Academy in the Cleveland area. That academy is running in partnership with the Aspen Institute. It is a year-long fellowship. All of the fellows are in Cuyahoga County this time around, but we're hoping to take it on the road. And so if you are in a community that you think can benefit from an academy, if you are interested in learning more, please do reach out. We would love to talk about what that could look like down the road. And then really the last kind of update announcement I have, if you haven't seen it already, yesterday, the coalition publicly released a new report looking at 10 occupations across Ohio that pay wages that keep people eligible for public benefits, particularly for SNAP and Medicaid. And this is a very timely topic, given that we're talking budget, federal budget and state budget. And, certainly as we think about work requirements, as we think about what it means when we as Ohioans are experiencing, or at least some of us are experiencing particularly low rates of unemployment, we ought to be thinking about what does work really look like for those of us who are in frontline jobs, low-wage jobs that kind of leave us needing additional supports and resources. So Carter, I think, has probably already dropped that in the chat, but do definitely encourage you to read it and keep an eye out because we will be releasing additional information that came out of that research over the course of the summer. So we have some information about what benefit uptake looks like by race. We have some additional information about wages in each occupation by race. And so we really want to make sure that we get all of that out to you in a way that makes sense and allows us to dig into and explain a bit more about why we're seeing what we think we're seeing, particularly as we talk about the quality of jobs in Ohio. So with that, move into the webinar for today. You are welcome to stay on camera or turn your cameras off. You are also welcome to, or we invite you to stay on mute, really recommend you stay on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will get to them as we are able. Also would be really great if you introduced yourself in the chat, said hi, let us know if you have anything you particularly want us to cover today. And then do want to invite any of you who are interested in membership or want to learn a bit more to stick around after the webinar today. I'm going to hang out and will be available. So with that, I want to take a moment to introduce our speakers for today. As I mentioned, we're talking budget. We have Caroline Treschitta, who collaborates with federal and state policy staff from her seat at the National Skills Coalition. Caroline has been part of the government affairs team there and provides policy analysis of new and proposed policies to our network. She has connected, She's connected to the SkillSpan State Network, and that includes partners like the Ohio Workforce Coalition. Caroline previously interned and then worked for Women in Government, was a legislative intern for Senator Chris Murphy, and worked for RAIN, where they used crisis intervention skills to assist those impacted by sexual assault. After we hear from Caroline on the federal level, we will hear from Sarah Hudacek, who is a policy and communications associate for Advocates for Ohio's Future, and has been with AOF for 2 years now. That time has flown, Sarah. Wow, that's gone really fast. Sarah tracks the ARPA funding, monitors and advocates on state budget and other legislative issues, and really has been in the weeds on a lot of what's going on with the Public Benefit Accountability Task Force and other policy areas. So that's who we will be hearing from. And as always, we will leave plenty of time for Q&A. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Caroline.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you to Carter for setting this up and providing so much helpful assistance. And yes, just congratulations again on that report from the Ohio Workforce Coalition. I was really impacted by the data, and honestly just really proud to be a partner with you all, just centering racial equity and equitable outcomes in the workforce. You know, as you mentioned in your intro, I work primarily like at the national and federal level, and honestly, I'm still surprised sometimes that not all national and federal serving organizations take such an approach to racial equity. So I was so glad to see that report, so glad that we're aligned. And yes, really, I think primarily I'm here today to talk a little bit about the federal budget process and how that works. I'll also talk about kind of just current events in Congress because it's very relevant to the federal budget process. And then I will conclude by just giving you all kind of an advocacy update with National Skills Coalition. So I do have some slides. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I think you all are familiar with National Skills Coalition, so I'm really not going to spend too much time at all on the background information about NSC, but of course, skills training is really our bread and butter. I focus on all workforce development policies from the federal lens, and I primarily work with Congress and the administration to advance those policies with our partners like yourself. And we are focused on making sure everyone has access to skills training that wants it, so that workers have access to a better life, and also so that American businesses can see sustained growth. And we do that in conjunction with all of our network partners like yourselves at the state level. I mentioned our national partners. We also work with small and mid-sized businesses, and we also are working with workers themselves through our grassroots campaign, Voices for Skills. I kind of already went through the agenda, so that's what you can expect in the next 15 minutes. Okay, so let's get into it. So the federal budget process. Really, so normally what happens is it starts, the annual appropriations process starts with the presidential budget request, or the PBR, as I like to say. I think it's kind of funny, you know, like the beer. So normally the president will submit a presidential budget request. It's normally the first week of February. I know that because we used to have our skills summit, our big annual event, the first week of February, so they would come at the same time. Now our skills summit is in May, as you all know. So the presidential budget request kicks off the appropriations process. It really is a signifier of what the administration's priorities are going to be, at least for the next year, if not longer. Of course, when Congress and the presidential branch are controlled by the same party, there is normally more alignment. So if it's a Democratic president with a Democrat-controlled Congress, there's going to be more alignment. Something else to note is often the first presidential budget request, like the first year that that president is in office, is really the big signifier. The ones after that, sure, they're important, but really kind of the first one is where you're going to see like the boldest ideas. So for example, with President Biden right now, his first year in office, his presidential budget request was the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, and put those together, it was the Build Back Better agenda. So that is the first kind of kickoff. Then I'm going to move to my next slide here. You might all remember from, if you took any like civics or government and politics class way back in high school, you might remember Congress, of course, has the power of the purse. So they have that, as I said here, like they have the power to set the total level of discretionary funding. How this works, there's about 16 committees in the House and then 11 committees in the Senate. There's more members of the House, so that's why there's more committees. Each of those committees is supposed to draft a bill with what they want funded within their committees that they have jurisdiction over. So for us as workforce advocates, the most relevant committees are on the House side, the Education and Workforce Committee. It used to be called the Education and Labor Committee. They just changed their name. And then on the Senate side, the HELP Committee, which stands for Health, Education, Labor, Pensions. So those are our two really relevant committees. And so all 20 so of those committees will draft up what they want in the appropriations process. Then the kind of presiding appropriations committee on both the House and the Senate will take all those bills that the committees drafted and turn it into one large package that has to pass the House and the Senate, and then the president has to sign that into law. So that is what happens in an ideal, perfect world if the government like ran super efficiently. But that honestly hardly ever happens. If you keep up with the news at all, I'm sure you've seen it's often like right down to the wire of when the funding streams end. It's up to those like last days in December where folks in Congress have to come to an agreement about how they're going to fund the government. And what normally happens is this kind of next bullet point I have here, continuing resolutions, which especially with a divided Congress, folks are just going to come to an agreement that we're just going to fund the government at the levels that it was funded on in the past. And we're not able to come to an agreement about what should be scaled back, what should be increased. So we're just going to fund level. So that is what happens kind of in a normal, kind of, I don't want to say every day, but every legislative session Congress. I also wanted to include here, what about earmarks? Maybe that is something that you've heard of or worked with before. I know the Ohio Workforce Coalition is often, interested in earmarks. So that is kind of discretionary funding that every congressional office in the House gets. They all get a certain amount of money set aside that they can use for community development projects. And as workforce advocates, because unfortunately our workforce system is underfunded and we're not able to do everything that we would like to do, we have to be scrappy, which means oftentimes, we are at the state and local level applying for that discretionary funding available within earmarks. But, earmarks are never guaranteed. In 2021, Democrats in the House ended the earmark process. It's also, as I said, only available in the House. So if your representative moves to the Senate or moves to the administration, you kind of lose that relationship that you had where you were getting the earmark every year, where you were getting a certain amount of funding every year. So while earmarks are great, and like I said, we have to be scrappy as workforce advocates, really, National Skills Coalition focuses on trying to transform our workforce system at a kind of higher level so that we're not all racing for these like kind of tinier, not guaranteed funding streams, but rather that we're all advocating for more guaranteed, dedicated, sustainable funding to our workforce system. So that is kind of at a high level. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what is going on in this Congress. So right now we have a Democrat-controlled Senate. It's very close, especially with, if senators are absent, if they have health issues. So it's a very thin Democrat majority in the Senate. And then in the House, they have a very thin majority of Republicans. And kind of same thing there. People are getting impeached over there. In the House, a very thin majority of Republicans, but that does create a divided Congress, which makes, you have to compromise, I guess, in a divided Congress, and it makes kind of passing anything really difficult. Also in this Congress is the first time that the Appropriations Committee, both in the House and the Senate, is chaired by 4 women. It's the first time in all of US history, which is really historic. And so it is chaired in the Senate by Senator Patty Murray, who was formerly head of that HELP committee. And she is from Washington State. She is a very pragmatic leader. She's very progressive. She's from Washington. She's a Democrat. And then she is with, in leadership, Senator Susan Collins from Maine, who is, of course, a Republican. And then in the House, it's led by Representative Granger and Representative DeLauro from Connecticut. So 4 women, and just in kind of my personal opinion, 4 people who are very pragmatic and very willing to compromise in terms of legislation. And, they signaled we want to go about that normal appropriations process that I described at the beginning, where, the 12 or so committees write up their bills, and then we create a large appropriations package. So they were pretty committed to doing that normal appropriations process. But again, I'm sure the word debt ceiling has, I'm sure you've heard of it. It's kind of dominating the news cycle right now, at least here in DC. And really what happened is, the United States government borrows a certain amount of money, and essentially we are running up on our debt, and we have reached the cap for which we can borrow money to fund programs. And so President Biden and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer were for expanding the amount of money that the US government is allowed to borrow, and just expanding that debt kind of cap, the debt limit cap, whereas Republicans have concerns about the amount of money that we are borrowing. They want to scale back the amount of money we owe. And so as a result, they are looking to cut non-defensive discretionary spending. So essentially they want to preserve our defensive spending and then cut back kind of our discretionary spending between 22 and 35%. And another huge part of that, I'm sure just being in this coalition that you've seen, they also want to add in work requirements for a lot of the federal workforce programs that we know, TANF, SNAP, et cetera. And that is kind of just a Republican narrative and policy point. And so, essentially what that means is, they want, as I said, they want to cut funding to these education and workforce programs that we all work with. And that is a problem because, as I mentioned, the workforce system is severely underfunded. And especially when you account for inflation, we are not even investing in our workforce at the levels that we did 20 years ago in 2001. And from the Biden administration, it looks like they want to come to some sort of compromise with the Republicans. So that might mean adding in those work requirements for accessing programs like TANF and SNAP. It might mean some cuts to our programs, et cetera. There is, of course, like national advocacy happening in response to this, and state and local level advocacy happening in response to this. National Skills Coalition is strongly opposed to work requirements. And I think also, when you think about adding in work requirements, that takes capacity. Like folks have to track those work requirements. So even though, it's kind of billed as a money saving measure, really that takes capacity within the workforce system. So those are current events. I just say that because I feel like it's very relevant to the federal budget process right now. But ultimately, workforce advocacy, advocacy from workforce stakeholders is important to the appropriations process. Because I mean, it sounds a little simplistic, but like the squeaky wheel gets the juice. And, we have to be really vocal that the money that we get is great, but it either needs more flexibility, more alignment across systems, et cetera. And essentially, folks just need to hear from us as workforce advocates at basically every point of the appropriations process, which is why, you're all plugged in with NSC. At NSC, we always release an analysis of the presidential budget request when it comes out, just about what it means for the workforce development field. And then, a lot of you were with us for the Skill Summit a few weeks ago, where kind of one of our primary asks was investment. And so legislators have heard from us that, these are programs that should not be cut. So building on that, I just want to talk a little bit more about our federal advocacy right now. As I mentioned, we're coming off our largest federal advocacy event. We had close to 500 people in attendance, including, I'm sure, some of the folks on this call. So, policymakers know that this is an important issue to you all in your field. Also, right now, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act is up for reauthorization. That is like kind of the primary workforce funding bill, Title I, Title II, adult education, and Title III. National Skills Coalition recently released our recommendations for reauthorizing that piece of legislation. It has not been reauthorized since 2014, so nearly 10 years, and it's time to update that bill to make it more responsive to the needs of a modern workforce system. So I would recommend checking out our recommendations there. And then at a federal level, again, because that's where I work at the federal level, we are making sure we get those recommendations in front of key policymakers. And all of those recommendations are really centered in trying to make our workforce system have outcomes that are more racially equitable. So there's recommendations around data collection, there's recommendations around partnerships between industry and training providers, and there's recommendations on investment for quality outcomes. So that is some of the advocacy we're like right in the middle of. We also have a post-secondary policy campaign that we call Making College Work for Working People. Those are some of the policies around Pell Grants, expanding federal financial aid to shorter term, higher quality programs so that more workers and students can access those short-term certificates that are often the first step in someone's career. Rebecca, I saw you came off mute. Did you have a question?
Well, I'm curious, as you think about the budget process and you think about these policy recommendations, really looking at the intersection of the two, how do you decide what you're going to advocate for through the budget versus what needs to happen in some other process?
Okay, yeah, I totally see that.
And what's happening with it, like what workforce specific is being advocated for through the budget process?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So right now I would say like what workforce specific is being advocated through the budget process. It is like all around that debt ceiling right now. And so essentially it's like kind of trying to work with the right people to make sure there aren't cuts and that there aren't work requirements. Okay. And then, so these like kind of larger pieces of recommendation of legislation between WIOA and between things like short-term Pell, those are bills that can be wrapped up in a larger legislative package. So part of it is what we want to advocate for as a workforce field, and part of it is what is Congress going to work on. So, so with something like WIOA, there's been advocacy from the Hill, from Congress, that they want to move on a WIOA reauthorization. And so we try and write recommendations that are, again, in line with investment, but also, what we want to see changed in the workforce system. Did that answer your question?
It's helpful. I think it's hard to acknowledge, I guess, that we have to play defense now as we're preparing for what sort of, sports analogies aside, as we're preparing for when we're up at bat with something that we can be more proactive around. And so I think it's important to think that through. And I think Sarah will probably touch on this, but the point about work requirements and debt, and it's very relevant for Ohio because Ohio has been experiencing, as our lieutenant governor has highlighted, the record low unemployment. And at that point, it's okay, how do we get more people into work? And what does that mean for getting people off of certain benefits? And so it is all wrapped up. It's the federal process can just be so huge. It's helpful to hear you bring, okay, what are we working on as part of budget versus what can be wrapped up in a larger conversation.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. And that is just, as I said, that is just at the federal level. As you all know, we also have like a state team, a policy and research team that's working to make sure that all the money that's coming through the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, is being implemented at a state level. But that's a whole other presentation for another time. Hopefully that kind of gave you an overview of the federal budget process, just kind of a quick and dirty one. I put my email there if you guys have any follow-up questions. But overall, thank you so much for letting me present. I hope that
I'm sure there will be questions for sure. And I will say, on behalf of the folks who were in DC earlier this month with the National Skills Coalition, we met with both of our US senators' offices, and we met with about half a dozen different officials from across the state. The two things that I think were, and there's others who should jump in who were there as well, but the two things that came up from a federal budget and federal advocacy perspective was really clear understanding of the importance of expanding Pell to short-term high quality credentials, which is known as the Jobs Act. It was actually two Ohio representatives that are co-sponsoring that in the House. And so it was really great to get, I think every office was in support of that particular piece of legislation. That matters because certainly it makes Pell available to non-credit bearing programs that are often more directly connected to workforce, but also because that means workforce dollars can be spent on the supportive services, the other sorts of training that doesn't fit, and just, can be used in different places. And so that was great. The other thing that came up a lot was work requirements and the fact that Ohio is a mandatory SNAP, which is food support, mandatory employment and training state, one of only 8 across the country. So we talked about what that means, how investments in SNAP employment and training are impacted by the mandatory versus voluntary SNAP programming. And I raise that now as sort of a segue into some of what I'm sure Sarah is going to touch on from the state budget, because the state, again, it's how do we get people off of public assistance and into jobs? Businesses are clamoring for talent. We want to support that, but we also want to recognize that people need to eat. People in school need to have food stability as they're developing those skills. And so it's really the intersection of state and national conversations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah Hudacek, who is a Policy and Communications Associate with Advocates for Ohio's Future. And AOF has been an important partner. And I hope you're going to share a little bit about what AOF is. If you weren't planning to, I think that would be great as well.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Rebecca. And thanks to Carter and the Workforce Coalition. I'm really excited to be here. And Advocates for Ohio's Future, our director is Kelsey Bergfeld. And Kelsey and I are the 2-woman team that makes up AOF. And on the next slide, I do have a little bit of an overview of what AOF is. So we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition, and we represent more than 500 organizations across the state. And we're led by 30 statewide organizations that make up our steering committee, including the Ohio Workforce Coalition, and who really direct our work. And AOF is centered on lifting up the most pressing HHS issues that face every corner of the state, and we really speak with one voice and kind of break down the silos between all of our HHS sectors that really allows us to come together and work together in partnership. And so on the next slide, I have a little bit of an overview of the state budgeting process. And so when we talk about the budget, which budget are we even talking about? Because Ohio has more than one, because of course we do. And so when AOF is working on the budget, when our members are working on the budget, we're predominantly focused on the operating budget, which happens every 2 years in odd numbered years. And it's the biggest of the budgets, and it totals $88 billion in state and federal funds. And it's also the most wide-reaching. It allocates funding for government programs, for public benefits, state and local government operations. It includes funding for nonprofit, non-governmental organizations, and also policy changes that don't require funding are also included in the budget. So a lot of times those policy changes can be easier to pass in a really big 5,000-page, $88 billion budget than in a standalone piece of legislation. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what you're talking about, but that's why it's all hands on deck, and it takes a lot of partners, a lot of coalitions, and a lot of stakeholders who are really watching the budget process, because it's a 6-month season with a lot of changes and a lot of new things, and we always want to have a full picture of what's going on at the State House. So on the next page, I kind of break down the process a little bit. So we've already concluded in the House, and right now the budget is in the Senate. We're in that first step where the budget's been introduced in the Senate, but we haven't seen that first round of changes. So this just tells you who the big players are in Senate finance: the chair, the vice chair, the ranking member. And on the next page, I want to, next slide, sorry, I want to zoom in a little bit on the timeline. So the timeline, the deadline for senators to submit their first round of amendments to what the House passed as the budget, that deadline has already passed. So those amendments are all being reviewed right now. We're expecting that first round of changes, that substitute bill, to come out on June 6th. And then the second round of changes for the omnibus amendment, that deadline is going to be very quick after that. Those are due on June 9th. We'll see that omnibus amendment sometime between June 9th and then when the committee is expected to vote the budget out on the 14th. And then the very next day, it's expected to be considered on the Senate floor. Now, as a rule, the House will not approve a concurrence vote. The budget's going to move to conference committee. That'll be the last 2 weeks of June. And then once the budget goes to the governor's office, he has to sign it by July 1st. That's the start of the next fiscal year. So going right up until the deadline there. And it's also important to note that even after conference committee, our advocacy isn't over because the governor has line item veto power. So we might be asking the governor to veto or not veto certain provisions so that we do have that final sort of push of advocacy there all the way to the very end. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to have a little bit of a caveat and note that throughout my presentation, I've included the comparison document number for these provisions, but this is not the same as the line item. So you wouldn't be able to use this number to search in the actual bill text, the 5,000 pages. But it's a really helpful document that's put out by the Legislative Service Commission that compares the initial governor's version, the House passed version, and then eventually the Senate version will be added here. So that CD number, I think, will be really helpful to you, but you'll just want to search in the comparison document to find that line item if you do want to look at like the actual legislative bill text, which bless you if you do. Next slide, please. So I want to dive right into workforce in the operating budget and kind of what we're paying attention to. So I want to briefly touch on these items. AOF is not diving super deep into each of these, but these are all newly created line items in the budget. And these were lines that were added to support establishing or expanding career tech programs. There's the new program in the Ohio Department of Higher Education called Super Rapids. And that would support collaborative projects to strengthen education and training opportunities. That's really at the regional level. So it's focused on that region's workforce needs. And then that internship pilot program that was also in the Department of Higher Education, that would have worked to connect college and career tech students with internships and co-ops, really with like the overarching goal of getting students to remain in Ohio, but that was eliminated in the House. So we'll have to see if the Senate adds that back in. On the next slide, the Ohio College Opportunity Grant. So this saw a really great improvement in the executive budget. The income eligibility to be eligible for this award was increased. The award amount for each student was increased. And so then, of course, the total line funding for the OCOG program per fiscal year was increased. But then we saw something interesting in the House passed budget. They made significant cuts to the program. So that added a caveat that there will be increased eligibility, there will be increased funding for each student, as long as the Chancellor of Higher Education determines that that funding level can support that. If later the Department of Higher Education decides that that's not the case, then they will actually return to a lower eligibility, a lower grant amount per student. So we'll see how that works out. In Medicaid reimbursement rates, so this was a really extraordinary advocacy push that we saw in the House, that we have seen really also in the Senate, a lot of advocates, a lot of providers, direct care workers coming in and speaking about the really dire need for rate increases really across the board in Medicaid. So these were hours of heartbreaking stories shared in committee hearings. And we were really glad to see that in the House, there was a wage increase included for direct care workers, and that would bring them up to $17 an hour in fiscal year 24 and then 18 and 25, excuse me. And what we're really hoping for in the Senate is to see that go up to a minimum of $20 per hour. The 17 and 18, that's really an average. So that would mean that there are still some direct care workers who are going to be paid what they're paid now, which is $12 an hour. And then we also saw increases for dental care, vision and eye care. So this is a federal option that Ohio adopted about 15 years ago, and that allows Ohioans with disabilities to earn up to 250% of the poverty level while still maintaining their Medicaid coverage. And that's really important because Medicaid covers personal care, home and community-based services. It's usually not covered by private insurance and not covered by Medicare. So this House change would lift that age cap. That would allow workers with disabilities to keep working, accessing Medicaid past age 64 if they choose. Totally optional there. On the next slide, let's talk about childcare. Let's talk about work supports, because these are really issues that have also seen a lot of testimony, a lot of advocates coming out at the State House, and childcare is really at the forefront of everyone's mind because we know that childcare providers were hit so hard by COVID and a lot have not recovered. So we have fewer childcare seats now than we did before the pandemic, and childcare teachers have an average wage in Ohio of about $12 per hour. And then we also know that about half of Ohioans live in childcare deserts, and that's defined as where the number of children outnumber the number of childcare seats 3 to 1. And childcare is expensive, that's increasing. The average cost of infant care in Ohio is $10,000 a year. So publicly funded childcare is really a vital program to help low-income families access childcare. And we were really excited that the governor's budget included an increase in initial eligibility from 142% up to 160%. Publicly funded childcare is unique in that it has a floor and a cap. So you have to enter the program if this passes, under 160%, and then you can stay on the program until you reach 300% of the federal poverty level. And that's estimated to serve an additional 15,000 kids. But we also just talked about how there's not enough childcare slots. So where would those kids go? And this next provision would have really helped with that. It was $150 million from the American Rescue Plan Act that would have established a childcare scholarship fund, and that would have helped cover the cost of childcare for those working in critical occupations. And childcare workers are considered a critical occupation. So that would have helped fill that gap, because we know that a lot of childcare teachers can't afford to send their children to even the center where they work. So that would have kind of removed that barrier, helped hopefully bring more folks into critical occupations like childcare. That was removed from the House, though, and a wide coalition of advocates, including AOF, including Groundwork Ohio, the Chamber of Commerce, are all asking for it to be reinstated in the Senate. And then at the bottom there, childcare infrastructure. This is a relatively small grant program. It's only $15 million per fiscal year, but this was added in the House for childcare infrastructure in Appalachia and also in communities across the state with high infant mortality. So that's a great start. Would be nice to see a bigger investment in that, though. And then on the next slide, want to talk about Medicaid eligibility. So we saw some major steps forward in Medicaid eligibility. We know Ohioans can't work when they're unwell, and parents can't work when their children are unwell. And unfortunately, a lot of times advocates have to frame our discussions of Medicaid solely around work supports, which we know Medicaid is a major work support, but we really have to lean into that frame when we're speaking with a lot of the frankly, Republican members of the State House. So you might notice that I'm framing it certainly that way when I'm speaking with you, because that's the way that we have to speak to the State House a lot of times. But Medicaid coverage for pregnant women and children under 19 with incomes up to 300% of the federal poverty level. Right now, it's currently set at 205% for pregnant women and 206% for kids up to 19. So that's a great expansion. Medicaid coverage for birthing doula services. So research has shown that doulas improve outcomes for moms and babies, and especially moms and babies of color. And we all know that not only are better outcomes for moms and babies cost saving, life saving, but when we're speaking to the General Assembly, we of course share that it helps parents return to work sooner. Over the last 3 years also, continuous Medicaid enrollment for eligible children through age 3. That's really great. That means that once a child is eligible, then they stay on the Medicaid program for the first 4 years of their life. They don't have to go through a redetermination process. A lot of, since children have a higher eligibility threshold than adults, a lot of times children fall off the rolls because parents don't realize that and they don't reapply. So this will be really great. And also children are our future workforce. So we want to make sure that they have a great start, that they're healthy. And then moving on to broadband. Over the last 3 years, we all know broadband is now a necessity for working, accessing care, accessing education. You really can't get by without it. So this addition of the broadband pole replacement undergrounding program in the House was really great to see. This is the first Ohio-based program to define broadband service as 100 megabits per second download and 100 megabits per second upload. We've started to see this higher threshold definition of broadband at the federal level, but this is the first thing that we've seen as a state program to have that definition. So that is really great to see. A really important step towards the internet speed that Ohioans actually need. And the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, this is federal funding. It's through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And really, this is just early stages, putting this in to anticipate funding that's going to come down from the federal level, but that funding hasn't actually been announced from the feds yet. And then on the next page, talking about food is a work support. Hungry Ohioans can't work, hungry Ohioans can't learn. So we're in the midst of one of the most unprecedented times for demand for food assistance. And the Ohio State Association of Food Banks was flat funded in the governor's budget. Thankfully, they did see an increase in the House passed budget, but we are standing with them in advocating for a total $50 million per fiscal year in the Senate, because we know that food banks, they're already rationing foods, they're seeing hours-long waits, just weeks away from having empty shelves. So this is really vital. And AOF is going to be delving more into the benefit cliff later this year. Benefit cliffs, I'm sure you all know from working with Rebecca, are when a worker might accept a small raise at their job that could put them over the eligibility limit for a public benefit program. And then, sorry, I'm having trouble with my voice. And then the cliff happens when the raise doesn't cover the amount lost from the public benefit program. So we're going to be looking at this because it has really widespread support now. It's a really unique time for both sides of the aisle. So that includes like the Ohio Chamber and the Buckeye Institute, recognizing that this is a barrier for work, a barrier for economic stability and self-sufficiency. So we were really glad to see this a hand up program. This included in the budget. It's a 2-year pilot program. It gives participants stipends to cover expenses that are associated with work, like health insurance premiums, childcare costs. We know it's going to take a big investment from the state and possibly a restructuring of our public benefits programs to make the path to economic stability less rocky. So it's really great to see that the General Assembly is investing funds, investing time in finding a solution. And on the next slide, I really want to dive into, so what's missing? We've talked about a lot of work supports. There's a lot more out there. The earned income tax credit in Ohio is currently non-refundable. So that means it can only be applied towards a low-income worker's outstanding tax liability. It doesn't result in a cash return. And a refundable EITC would give Ohio workers that cash refund when they file their taxes. It's a great way to reward work. And Ohio's one of only 6 states with a non-refundable EITC. So that makes us a state with one of the weakest EITC programs in the nation. We already talked about childcare. We already talked about direct care. And then I also want to lift up the work of our partners at the Hunger Free Schools Ohio Coalition. They had a huge win in the House, securing funding for students who receive reduced price meals in Ohio in school to be covered for free. But we are joining them to continue to push for free breakfast in schools for all students as well. So, I mean, just like I said about having to frame this in a very specific way in order to have buy-in at the State House. I mean, in addition to the numerous benefits that include like removing stigma, cutting down on child hunger, students who are fed perform better in schools, but there's also data that shows that students who receive free meals have higher attendance rates. That's really important for working parents, and students are our future workforce. And then I want to share a little bit about what we're watching, what we are preparing to possibly see in the Senate budget. We're really preparing and gearing up to protect public benefits programs from any additional administrative barriers or cuts. We're going to continue to share data with the State House that can clear up the misunderstanding of public benefits recipients in Ohio. Like, we know that the vast majority of public benefits recipients are already working, and it's not an issue of working or not working. It's really just that the math doesn't add up. An Ohio parent of 2 who works full-time at minimum wage, which is just $10.10 an hour in Ohio, they qualify for every public benefits program in Ohio except for TANF cash assistance. So this idea, that no one on public benefits is working, that's not true. It's a harmful narrative. It's really rooted in racist stereotypes, and cutting benefits, adding work requirements, that doesn't send people back to work. The reality is just that many full-time jobs don't provide enough to support a family in Ohio. And so instead of restricting access to public benefits or adding more red tape, really what we'll be encouraging the legislature to look at instead are proven policies that promote work, and that's flexible scheduling, predictive scheduling, paid leave. We talked a lot about childcare today, affordable health insurance, and that doesn't include high deductible health plans, retirement funds, life insurance, transportation, housing, nutritious food. All of these things are really things that the State House can address that would help Ohioans with barriers return to work a lot more than work requirements or cutting benefits. And on the next page, I just want to say we have social media. We have our weekly newsletter. Please connect with us. Send Kelsey or I an email if you have any questions. We would love to talk to you about what you're watching in the state budget. And it, like I said, it's an all hands on deck. So advocates, especially, nowadays, really have to help each other out. So thanks so much, Rebecca and Carter, for having me. Oh, Rebecca, I think you're muted.
I was, because I am at least once every meeting when I try to talk. Yes, thank you for being here. Certainly want to welcome questions. I will, excuse me, add also that, we talk about the federal budget, we talk about the state budget, Advocates for Ohio's Future as the convener and voice of, 500. I don't think I knew that it was 500 different organizations at this point, particularly from the human services space, is incredibly valuable. And really, we're, I think, as a field at this unique time where the workforce and the workplace and employers are all coming with kind of a changed understanding of what's needed, what's wanted. And so really is a unique opportunity to think about what the world of work looks like for people, as well as what employers can do. And I know there's several of you on here who are working really closely with companies that want to do what's good and best for their employees. And so I think really the conversations we want to have are at the intersection of the two. And I have a bunch of questions. I always have questions for Sarah, so I could keep talking, but if you want to come off mute, we did get one question about childcare. Kelly, if you want to, do you want to field that here?
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to everybody who's sharing great information. Sarah, thanks for your update at the state level. I did have a quick question. I'm excited to see, I'm an Ohioan, but I was gone for the last 6 years working in Oregon. We're working pretty closely with the Women's Bureau on childcare access and childcare in the construction sector. So now I'm back in Pike County, excited to see that there's some momentum at the state level for funding childcare initiatives. But as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, it's not enough money. There's not enough employers, and there's not enough childcare workers, and there's not enough childcare workers making a living wage. Yeah. So, we here in Pike County, we run Head Start programs, and there's to me, it's like a no-brainer. Like, hey, let's do childcare all year, but how do we bring more dollars? How can we advocate for more dollars, and how can we do it at the state level, but also at the federal level? They're funding chips manufacturers to fund, get some funding to nonprofits also who are doing this work and could start expanding childcare access. So I don't know if I have a question or if I'm just rambling, but excited to see this and hopefully can lend some support to any advocacy efforts around that. Because when we look at who's missing out on work, there's obviously all parents are impacted, but it's largely women, right? So we got to fix that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly, and welcome back. I'm thrilled to have Kelly back in Ohio. What do you think, Sarah? Asking for more money right now is insanely difficult. So, and I'm sure that's not new really in Ohio. So what are your thoughts? I default to, well, could we get this money, or could we get a percentage, like the transportation budget for workforce? Could we get a percent of that yeah. Anyway, I'll let you talk, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kelly. And that's really the crux of the issue is, we haven't really solved anything yet. But we did. So Kelsey and I were in a meeting with a senator yesterday who said, well, we solved childcare, so what else do you got? And so I think that if there is this perception that there was a lot of money that came into Ohio for childcare from the American Rescue Plan Act. And the General Assembly last year convened a publicly funded childcare task force that kind of dove into the issues and released some recommendations, but those recommendations, they weren't binding, so they don't have the force of law, and there's also no guarantee since we switched General Assemblies between December and now that anyone will really act on those recommendations. So I think that really elevating that this is still an issue, that childcare is not fixed, that it took a lot of money to just make sure that childcare, what is left now, was able to be sustained throughout the pandemic. And so coming in and speaking in committee hearings and talking to your legislators, I'm sure you're all already doing that, but keep doing it because there is this perception that childcare is fixed and that that's not the reason why people aren't going back to work. And that couldn't be farther from the truth.
I think this notion of speaking to legislators, it's easy to think, well, lots of people do that, so we shouldn't, or we can't because we work here, we work there. So that's something that you'll see more about from the coalition. Certainly, while elected officials are in district over the summer. We want to do more district work so that, I mean, again, the budget is a 6-month process that we're near the tail end of, but what do we need to do to keep raising these critical issues? Kathleen put a question in the chat about research gaps around policies that may seem to benefit the workforce. I'm not sure I'm completely clear. I feel like I might be getting your question wrong. Kathleen, are you asking about things we think work, but that don't work? Or do you mind hopping off and clarifying?
Sure. Sorry, that was a really weirdly worded question. I was your last slide about the like what to look ahead and keep on our minds. I was just thinking, is there anything out there that we would like to be advocating for, but there's just not the research to back it up? So like thinking about like how higher ed and future doctorate and master students could support the work, what research needs to still be done for different policies that we kind of have a gut feeling would benefit the workforce, but there's nothing to back it up currently, or very minimal.
I have some ideas. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a big question, because I think that part of the trouble as advocates is that a lot of times we don't have data on very much at all in terms of outcomes of how programs are working. So, I mean, legislators might look at, I know that we were talking about work requirements a little bit earlier and how that's a conversation at the federal level, and policymakers might look at work requirements and say, that's great, if we can just require people to work. But we have, some sort of piecemeal anecdotal evidence that I think it would be instinctual to all of us advocates that work requirements might boost employment in the short term, but long term do nothing to help families and workers on the path to economic stability for their families. So I think that it's so hard to pinpoint just a couple of gaps because there is so many pieces where we're trying to make a case to legislators that we have stories of people who have gone through work requirements, for example, and we know that it doesn't work because we've heard this from folks on the ground, from folks who've gone through work requirements, but we don't have that concrete data to share. So I think that almost across the board, you could say, and I know that that's not the answer you were hoping for, but I think that across the board, you could really say that we need a lot more research on outcomes so that we can really lift up what's working and what's not with a lot more evidence behind it.
And I think, so we took a stab at initial policy recommendations, some thinking around that and data in the most recent report. So if you look at the data related page of the report, the coalition released, Carter dropped it in the chat, looking at different state agencies and the data that they provide and what is publicly available, what's not. I think that might be a way to answer a little bit of what you're asking, Kathleen. I also think this question of, it's really easy to say Ohio unemployment is at record lows. When you start digging into who it's low for, and we see persistent and, when we see persistent rates of Black and brown worker unemployment being that double of white unemployment, I think that's something to think about and look into what do we see when we disaggregate the data? So any research that gets into disaggregating the data. And then another sort of more emerging space is what does work really look like? So there's a lot of data showing that diverse workplaces that invest in job quality sorts of initiatives do better. They're more competitive, they're successful, they retain and attract talent at higher rates. But really making that something that is specific to Ohio firms and specific to firms that are working in Ohio, I think would also be useful, because a lot of times it's like, well, that's from New York, upstate New York, and that's so different than Ohio, or it's from Chicago, and that's really different than Cleveland. And so I think that's another space where looking at what makes work and what's good for companies is just an opportunity for us to really lean into from a research perspective. I hope that answers your questions. There's a lot of ideas out there.
Yeah.
Other questions? Oops, sorry. Go ahead, Kathleen.
That's okay. Just saying thanks.
So we're starting to have some folks fall off. We're right up against 2:00. I want to welcome any additional questions you may have. If you didn't get them in today, feel free to email them. If you've got ideas, the policy committee of the Ohio Workforce Coalition is convening next week to start really digging into, okay, we have a sense of what the budget's going to look like, where we want to put our energy for the next couple of years. And so would love to hear from you now. And thank you, Sarah, for being here. Thank you all for being here. We will circulate the deck and the recording to webinar. If you've got any other questions, always feel free to reach out. And with that, we'll see you next month.